But back to Butler. He signed the Constitution. He took credit, by the way, for the Electoral College. So if you are upset about the Electoral College system for presidential elections, you can blame him. And he was the first U.S. Senator from South Carolina.
You were listening to Historyman, the platform for historians, curators, and authors to tell their stories of the American Revolution, walk in the footsteps of heroes, and proclaim freedom reigns. On today's episode, we are with Tom Elmore, a historian and South Carolina state historian for the Ancient Order of Hiberniums. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Tom, you and I have run into each other in various events over the course of the last few years. I'm very interested in your background and your research into the Irish in South Carolina during the American Revolutionary War. So I'm going to kind of turn it over to you and tell us a little bit about that. But, the Irish fought on both sides. I know that we talked to, if you talk to our friend Tom O'Block out of Camden, who's tied in with the artillery crew out there, he will say that really the Irish kind of helped the British in many ways on their side, but you're taking the Irish from the Patriot side. So love to hear your side of the story. So talk to us a little bit about the Irish.
Yeah, actually, I got a little bit about the Loyalist Irish, but how this got started is, as you said, I'm the state historian for the Ancient Order of Hibernians, a Irish Catholic fraternal organization that's over 180 years old here in the United States. And I was going on a project to identify as many Irish sites in South Carolina. I'm around 250 at the moment, by the way. And I noticed that about 1/4 to 1/3 of them were either directly or indirectly related to the American Revolution. So I said, okay, this is something I need to investigate a little further. And then Nelson McLeod, we both know him, Joffrey Trader Chapter, the SAR, sent me a link about a man who had found that 11% of all men who applied for a pension for services in the American Revolution from South Carolina were born in Ireland. So that just kind of deeper and deeper. And so I start investigating and looking for people who are Irish by what we call both birth and by blood, and found quite a few, and it keeps growing and growing. And then a couple of weeks ago, I decided to, I was looking at Moss's book and noticed that he mentioned a lot of them that were born in Ireland in his description. So I started making a list of all those. And then someone I hope we get a chance to talk to, Reverend William Martin, who led, brought 5 ships of Irish Presbyterians called conventors to South Carolina in 1772. Found 60 of them were fought in the Revolution. And so my list keeps growing and growing, and I got a little statistical breakdown about most, obviously, were privates, but I found some colonels, lieutenant colonels, oddly enough, only one major, a whole bunch of captains. In fact, in looking at some of these regiments, I think there were more captains than privates in some of them. Lieutenants, sergeants, oddly enough, no corporals, but about 150 privates. And then some that I cannot, are like different, like one was an adjutant general. And I've identified about 30 different regiments they were in. The Fairfield District Regiment had 34, and that was the largest of all of them. The 3rd South Carolina Regiment had 26, and New Acquisition had 18. That would have been York County.
If you don't mind, do you delineate between the actual total Irish and Scotch Irish, or are there differences there?
Well, it's probably safe to say that just about everyone I found so far was probably what I would prefer Presbyterian Irish. Though there are some that would call Anglican or Episcopal Irish.
Okay.
I can pretty much explain it. From Beaufort, Charleston, and Georgetown counties, most of the Irish there were probably, members of the Church of England or the Church of Ireland, as it's called in Ireland still to this day. While those in the upstate, and primarily what I would say is the I-85 and the upper I-70 corridors, were the Scotch Irish. Now, they didn't call themselves Scotch Irish back then. The term Scotch Irish is actually a late 19th century term. In those days, they would call themselves Orange Irish or Ulster Irish or Presbyterian Irish. Scotch Irish came about because they wanted to differentiate themselves from the Catholic Irish. So that's a relatively new term. But yeah, most of everyone I to be talking about, if they were not from the coastal counties, they were more likely Presbyterian Irish.
Some of the people that we were talking about that were Irish or had the Irish ancestry, whether it be Ulster Scots or whatever, you were mentioning a couple of the leaders. Did you say Andrew Pickens was tied in with that group?
Yeah, Andrew Pickens, it was Scotch Irish.
Certainly not a Catholic Irish. He was certainly Presbyterian, yes?
Right, he was a very devout Presbyterian. In fact, he was sometimes, well, his most famous nickname, supposedly given to by the Cherokees, was the Wizard Owl, but a lot of his people called him the Fighting Elder because he was an elder in the Presbyterian Church. He's, of course, buried at Old Stone Church outside of Clemson. And very careful with his words. There's a great story I love about him that they said that he would take that when he speak, he would put the words in his hand, look them over, and then put them back in his mouth and then utter them.
What are some of the highlights of your research into the Irish? Where
Well, like I said, the statesmen have been probably one of the biggest surprise. The biggest one surprise is David Ramsay, who someone that when I read about him, I said, why haven't I heard about this guy? He was the son of an Irish immigrant. He was born in Pennsylvania. He was a graduate of what we now call Princeton, and also got a medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania. And then afterwards, he moved to Charleston. And he is credited with introducing the smallpox vaccine in South Carolina. And you and I might not be talking today if it weren't for that one little simple act. And he was very successful doctor. He was a surgeon in the 4th South Carolina Regiment and was imprisoned in St. Augustine, Florida. In fact, a lot of prominent South Carolinians were sent to St. Augustine after the fall of Charleston. There's a spot, I've been to the spot there. It's now a nice little park down there. But he was in the U.S. Confederation Congress, briefly serving as pro tem. And he was also an abolitionist at a time when abolitionism was not very popular in the South. But he co-founded the Medical Society of South Carolina and served as president, which is still in existence. He was given an honorary doctorate medicine degree from Yale. And in 1803, he was elected a member of the American Philosophical Society, which was co-founded by Ben Franklin to promote research and study of humanities and natural sciences. Since 1743, when Franklin founded it, only 5,700 members. It's only had 5,700 members from around the world. So very elite company. And Ramsay actually corresponded with Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. His biggest legacy is historical works. He wrote The History of the Revolution in South Carolina, published in 1785. Said to be the first book to be given a copyright in America. And then he followed up with a 2-volume History of the American Revolution. And both these books are still cited by historians today because they're unique in that they're written from the perspective of someone who was there and saw some of this stuff. He wrote one of the first biographies of George Washington, Life of Washington, and then in 1809 he published a 2-volume History of South Carolina. He also is credited by some as being the first victim of a political assassination. He was shot and killed outside of his house in 1815 by a local tailor who Ramsay had testified against in court. The court wanted to know this guy was literally mentally certifiably insane. Ramsay examined and said yes, he was. So he was sent to an asylum, eventually got his release somehow, bought a pistol, and shot Ramsay right in front of his house in the street. And what's kind of sad is last fall I went to Ramsay's grave. I was taking pictures for a PowerPoint I was doing. And you really have to look for his, you need to go to find the grave to get an image of it because it's broken in half. His name is not on the grave. And I mean, it's really a sad shame that someone who was so prominent and so noteworthy, I would say he's probably as close an answer South Carolina ever produced during that era to Franklin or Jefferson, is honored so poorly. It could at least put a plaque by it or something, but I digress. But then again, too, also looking though, and this is kind of my soapbox here, is doing my research and looking at graves all across the state and seeing a lot of forgotten graves. I mean, there's some spots where where patriots are buried, where you could be standing right in the middle of the cemetery and not know it's there because it's so overgrown in such a wilderness.
You're exactly right. I was
Yeah.
recalling one of the battles in Lexington County, and the graves of those particular soldiers that were killed on both sides are nothing but field stones out in the middle of a current cornfield in Lexington County. So unmarked graves for the most part. You don't know who they are. And these were actual people who died for the American Revolution, for our freedoms today. It is sad.
Yeah. Well, here in Columbia, there's a cemetery, Davis, I believe the name of it is. It's literally located right between the Earlwood and Elmwood subdivisions, just north of the original city limits. I heard about it. I decided to go out and check it out, and I could only get maybe 10 feet in because I didn't have a machete. It was so badly overgrown with stuff. So, yeah, it's sad. It really is.
Where is this at?
It's between the Elmwood and Earlwood subdivisions.
Okay.
In Columbia.
Right.
Yeah, right by railroad tracks. Don't remember the exact street, but yeah, that's a rough general location. There's been World War II veterans buried there.
Well, who are some other Irish heroes and soldiers from back then?
Well, we're going to talk about two more, a couple more statesmen. You got Thomas Hayward and Thomas Lynch, excuse me, and Thomas Lynch Jr., the only father and son team to ever serve together. The elder Lynch was in the first and second Continental Congress. I think he was also in the Stamp Act Congress. Unfortunately, in 1776, he had a stroke. His son, Thomas Jr., that was not exactly good health either. He was in the Continental Army for a brief period and went to North Carolina recruiting trip and got a serious stomach fever and haunted him for the rest of his days. He went to Philadelphia. And if you look at the Declaration of Independence and where the South Carolina signers are, there's a gap between Edward Rutledge and Thomas Lynch Jr., and that gap was intended for Thomas Hayward Sr. to sign. But he was too ill to ever do it, so it more or less became a tribute to him, and he died en route to South Carolina, the elder Lynch, that is, and he's buried in Annapolis. The junior Lynch, he decided a couple of years later that he wanted to go to France to see if his health would improve. And his ship was lost in the Caribbean in a storm with all hands on board. And Lynch, the junior Lynch, was the second youngest signer of the document, and he was the youngest one to die. And his signature is consequently one of the most valuable and rarest of all signers of the Declaration. I think there's only like 24 copies known to exist. And in 2016, one went for $250,000 at auction.
Well, yeah, that's petty cash for you and I, right?
Yeah, go look in your act, see what you got. And then you had the brothers, the Rutledge brothers, Edward and John Rutledge. Both were trained in London as lawyers. Both were very successful, though Edward, reading between the lines, I think he was more successful. Probably was sort of the F. Lee Bailey of South Carolina in that era. Both served in the first and second Continental Congress as the only pair of brothers to serve. John Rutledge left to become the governor of South Carolina and basically ran the state government in exile for the latter part of the Revolution, pretty much wherever he went. That was the state government. His main contribution as governor, I think, was a couple of things. First, he not abandoned, Charles Lee was in Charleston, General Charles Lee, calling for, saying, this place is indefensible, abandon it. He refused to abandon it. They made the stand. Of course, we know what happened on June 28, 1776 at the Battle of Fort Sullivan. And then afterwards, in exile, he promoted Sumter, Marion, and Pickens to the rank of Brigadier General, was able to get them to coordinate at least somewhat, and also work with Nathaniel Greene. And after the war, he went to the Confederation Congress. He's the only person to serve in the Stamp Act, First Continental, Second Continental, and Confederation Congress in South Carolina. And then later, he was on the Constitution Committee and Convention and signed the document and was one of the original Associate Justices of the U.S. Supreme Court and was briefly the Chief Justice. Edward signed the Declaration. Then afterwards, he came back to South Carolina and was given several offers to hold national offices, and he refused. And that's one of the things I've found in looking at all these statesmen is most of them hardly served at all in federal government. They pretty much spent most of their time in state government. One point out said that he considered serving his state to be more important than serving the nation. There's one other I need to mention too quickly. Pierce Butler. Butler was actually born in Ireland. He came to America with the British Army. He fought in the French and Indian War, and then came to Charleston, married into the Middleton family, very wealthy, prominent family, and which brings up a part about history you don't hear that often. A lot of British officers were very happy to come to America because, well, and while few, like Cornwallis, was actually there because of patriotism, you had some, like Butler, who were coming to look to find a wife of a wealthy plantation owner or farmer or lawyer. And he was accused, of marrying her for money. He denied, and their marriage, to be fair, was very happy. Then you had some, like Banstreet Tarleton, who came to escape gambling debts. And then you had a whole bunch who came because they wanted to make whoopee away from their wives. That was said of General Johnny Burgoyne. I believe it was said he brought his mistress with him. General George Howe, General Clinton, all of them, pretty much, did the same thing. Lord Rawdon, who was Cornwallis' second in command here in South Carolina, he was not married, but he was alleged to father the child of the wife of another British officer. So you don't hear these stories in your history book, but that's it. Oddly enough, George III himself was actually very loyal to his wife and had a very happy marriage, which is more than can be said for his father, his grandfather, or his son, George IV, who, if you really want to read about a good way not to be a king, read about George IV. Oh boy, that guy was a cad.
If you're looking for pillars of moral integrity, I'm not sure that this is the place you need to look. That's for sure.
Right. But back to Butler. He signed the Constitution. He took credit, by the way, for the Electoral College. So if you are upset about the Electoral College system for presidential elections, you can blame him. And he was the first U.S. Senator from South Carolina.
So when you keep on saying they're Irish, they're from Ireland or whatever, and you had mentioned before that some of them were from the coastal regions, from the Ulster regions and that sort of thing. Where was Pierce Butler from?
Well, I'm going to say coastal. I was talking about the coastal region of South Carolina.
Okay. All right.
Butler, the Rutledges, and the Lynches, I would say probably from the southern part of Ireland because they were not Presbyterians. Southern, maybe Dublin, family from Dublin. I've not gone that far back in their genealogy.
So did they carry with them, in your research, did you find that they carried with them certain mannerisms or thought processes that brought from the homeland?
Yeah, I found a lot of them really did not like the English.
Okay.
The Rutledges did not like they stayed in London. So did Thomas Lynch Jr. And none of them came away impressed by the British aristocracy. And the Scotch Irish, well, a lot of them came to America because in Ireland at the time, and the whole United Kingdom, you had to pay taxes to the Church of England, regardless of whether or not you were a member. And that didn't sit well with them. And in fact, the Commoners, were a sect of Presbyterian that came in 5 ships to South Carolina in 1772. They looked upon the Church of England as bad as the King of England. So they wanted to, just do away with it altogether. And that's one reason why so many of the Presbyterians settled in the upstate. I mean, to be fair, a lot of the cheap land, good cheap land, was already gone, but they could get land really dirt cheap up there. And some people say, oh, they did because it reminded them of the mountains of Scotland. Aztecs may have been a part, but the real reason was they wanted to be as far away from the English and the Anglican Church as they could possibly get. And one of the little things interesting, too, I have to uncover in my research, is the Presbyterian Church at the time, I guess still does, required that the pastor or the leader of your church had graduated from college or gone to a seminary. But there was a dire shortage of people who fit the qualifications. So a lot of them became Baptists because the Baptist church said, no, at the time, you didn't have to be a seminarian or anything like that. And on a similar vein, Bishop John England, who was the first Catholic bishop of South Carolina, of the Diocese of Charleston. He came in the 1820s. He said that one of the things that really biggest challenge he faced was so many Irishmen came to South Carolina Catholic, but left their Catholicism because they couldn't find a Catholic church anywhere near them, so they joined whatever they could find.
That's interesting. You talked a little bit about the different counties had a cluster of Irish in those counties. You talked about the new acquisition district, for instance. Did they stay in little Irish villages, or did they stay in one particular spot? You know, like the Germans came to the Saxagatha region of Lexington County and brought with them a lot of the old time thoughts and customs and that sort of thing.
Oh, right, yeah.
Did the Irish do the same thing, or were they so spread out that they weren't able to?
It probably did. There is an interesting book by James Webb, who was a Secretary of Navy under Reagan, wrote a book about 20 years ago called Born Fighting, The History of the Scotch Irish. I recommend it highly, by the way. But yeah, like, Rantonville, for example, York County, pretty much Scotch Irish. A good example of how Scotch Irish affected Appalachian culture, clogging is basically derived from Irish step dance, like river dance. And in bluegrass music, the fiddle replaces the bagpipe. And a lot of a quote-unquote American folk songs are actually Americanized Irish songs. A good example would be like the song "The Belle of Alabama" was actually, I've heard different call, was originally "The Belle of Killarney." So, and the Bonnie Blue Flag song that was actually based on an Irish tune, the Irish Jaunty Car song. So yeah, so they definitely did. I mean, as far as an identity, like, how you have, like in New York City, you have Italian neighborhoods, Irish neighborhoods, Puerto Rico, and different ethnic groups. The Scotch Irish really didn't do that much, but the style of dress, the style of buildings, music, dance culture, and so forth, you can still see it if you know what to look and where to look. It's really quite obvious.
Is there any character of just the rank and file Irish that were during the Revolutionary War here in South Carolina? Is there any character that just kind of sticks out to you and go, well, that was a colorful guy?
Oh, there are several. Private Joseph Adair Sr., who was born in 1711. He enlisted in the American Army at 1775 at the age of 64. And left the service at age 71. He is one of the oldest men to have fought in the war, and possibly the oldest from South Carolina. He died in 1789. And then there's another one, Private Daniel McJunkin, who, when fleeing from a British officer, was stabbed by his sword, and according to one account, and I quote, "The blade entered between his shoulders and came out in the breast, and came so far through that McJunkin caught it and held it tightly in agony. The officer said to him, 'My good fellow, if you will let me, I will draw it out and give you as little pain as possible.' He did so, and the officer, putting his foot against McJunkin's shoulder, as he sat on his horse, extracted the sword, upon which McJunkin fell to the ground." McJunkin did make it back to health, and a couple of months later, he was fighting at the Battle of Kings Mountain. That's
a tough old bird, isn't he?
Oh, good Lord. I mean, and then another one I love, talk about a civilian, Mary Gavson McClure, who was born in Ireland. Legend has it she was melting pewter dishes to make bullets when Tory Captain Christian Huck busted in her house. When he tried to burn the family Bible, Mary snatched it from the officer and in turn struck it with the flat of his sword. The Tories all tried to burn down the house, but she extinguished the flames. Well, anyway, she sent word to her sons, who was with Thomas Sumter's camp, and they chased down Huck's men, and of course, that led to Huck's defeat at Williamson's plantation. And then this is what my wife likes. My wife is a seamstress. Jane Jeanette Walker, who was born in Ireland, and during the American Revolution, she carried messages to Thomas Sumter in the double heel of her sock. Now, in the old days, socks would have a heel in the back and also in the toe. You still see it put in, like symbolically in that. And that's because that's the part of the sock that always wears out the first. So by having a double heel, she had a little pocket in there she could put the messages in. So if she got caught, they wouldn't find it. And I hope the shoes and the socks and her feet were clean. Oh, and then there's one person story I love. He was a major, British Army here in South Carolina. His name was John Carden. He was born in Ireland in 1740, led the British forces at Battle of Hanging Rock, and supposedly contracted a heat illness. Now, his family was led to believe that he was killed in action at the Battle of Gulfport Courthouse. But in reality, that day, he was in Charleston getting married to another woman. Now, some believe he faked his own death to get married to this woman because he had been legally married since 1768 to a Scottish woman. Remember what I was saying about Whoopi? That did not stop him from marrying again because of this second faux wife, if you will, died 6 months after the wedding, but he married again. And then he died about a year later. So I always love that story. And then one other quickie for our friends in Greenville is Paris Mountain. It's named after a loyalist named Richard Paris. His name is actually spelled Pearis. And he is credited being the first white person in that area. And he, through rather dubious and illegal means, acquired 100,000 acres around the area and owned what is now Paris Mountain. When the war ended, he asked the British government for compensation because he lost all his property. And, you hear stories about loyalists who were sent to Nova Scotia and exiled and got nothing and no support. Well, he wound up getting over 5,000 pounds, or about over $1 million in today's money, and an annual pension of $14,000 in today's money. Although he actually filed for $3.2 million, he lived in the Bahamas. So, in this case, crime paid. And then you're talking about this. There were the Volunteers of Ireland, aka the Irish Volunteers, who were organized in Pennsylvania in 1777 by Lord Rawdon, who was Cornwallis' second in command. And they are credited with having the first St. Patrick's Day parade in New York in 1779. And they were participating in the siege of Charleston. They were commanded by Rawdon at the Battle of Camden, and really, they're the ones who caused the militia to run for their lives, and also fought at Hobkirk's Hill. Now, I kind of say what happened to them. When Charleston was evacuated, the volunteers went to New York. Well, they were mustered out when the city was evacuated in 1783, but they didn't go back to England. They went to Nova Scotia. The reason why is the English did not want more settlers in Canada and did not want any Irishmen back in England. Plus, it was cheaper to send them to Nova Scotia. So officially, on paper, they were returned to England in 1784. Yeah, there's one other person, a couple of quickies. There was a Samuel Clowney who, with the help of an African-American named Paul, captured a patrol of 5 loyalist soldiers by pretending he was commanding a large force of Patriots. When he took the prisoners to the Patriots camp, he was asked by the astonished commander how he did it. He said, "I surrounded them."
Do you have any projects that you got going on?
I do a PowerPoint based on this, and it's kind of like the never-ending story because I've done this PowerPoint now about half a dozen times, and it's never been the same because I'm always finding new information, so I'm having to go back and edit. But it's kind of fun, kind of a challenge. You can reach me on Facebook, just Tom Elmore.
If you could real quickly tell me your definition of liberty.
Well, I kind of go back to Franklin Delanor's 4 freedoms. Freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. When you have that, you have liberty.
Well, Tom, I appreciate your time. I hope people will reach out to you on Facebook, and you've got a great presentation, and I look forward to another episode with you. So thank you.
Oh, yeah. All right. Thank you.